Hello and welcome to Farm Connections. I'm your host, Dan Hoffman. On today's program, we learn about the finer points of agronomy with Jamison Schneckloth. Susan Waffle updates us on changes made to Squash Blossom Farm, and the University of Minnesota Extension provides us a best practices segment. All here today on Farm Connections.
Welcome to Farm Connections with your host, Dan Hoffman.
Farm Connections made possible in part by
Minnesota Corn, working to identify and promote opportunities for corn growers, enhance quality of life, and help others understand the value and importance of corn production to America's economy.
EDP Renewables North America, owner-operator of Prairie Star and Pioneer Prairie wind farms in Minnesota and Iowa. EDPR wind farms and solar parks provide income to farmers and help power rural economies across the continent.
Northern Country Co-op, a full-service cooperative in grain, agronomy, feed, and lumber. For the latest news, job openings, and podcasts, you can go to their website, ncountrycoop.com.
R&S Grain Systems, a family-owned business serving its customers for 50 years with leading designs in the manufacturing of grain handling equipment and grain storage systems. You can call them for a quote today. Employee-owned AgVantage Software, Rochester, Minnesota. 47 years designing and developing agribusiness software for grain elevators, feed manufacturers, producers, fertilizer and chemical dealers, co-ops, seed companies, and fuel distributors. Mower County Farm Bureau Association advocates for agriculture based on the policies and beliefs of its members. It's dedicated to making the voices of its members stronger. You can learn more about membership benefits at fbmn.org.
Welcome to Farm Connections. We traveled to rural Grand Meadow, Minnesota, to the Dan Gehling farm to learn a little bit about crops and soils and also about agronomy. And with me to help us is Jamison Schneckloth. Jamison, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
What exactly do you do?
Well, I'm an agronomist with CHS in Grand Meadow. And what an agronomist is, and how I define being an agronomist, is being a valued partner to these farms and their farming operations. So to put that into some context, if we're in this field of corn right now, it needed fertilizer, it needs chemical, it needs a seed to plant it, and it needs some agronomic advice to get as good looking as it is today. So essentially at the end of the day, I help each and every grower that I work with be able to make the valued decisions of where to place the crop, where to place the fertilizer, the chemical, and the nutrients to make that farm as successful as it can be.
Well, that's an important thing because we all like to eat, we like clothes, we like the fuel. Thank you for the work you do.
Yeah.
Now, this field looks really, really good. What steps did you help or do you help farmers do to get it to looking this good? All the way from seed selection, and what kind of conversations do you have with farmers?
Yeah, so a lot of background work goes into making a crop, and not too many people realize that. So to get to where we are today, it took conversations that took place 6 months ago. So it starts with talking about seed back in December, talking about fertility, talking about chemical options. And the biggest thing that I stress to growers is having a goal. So when you start back 6 months ago, what is your goal when the combine rolls through this field in September and October? What does that look like to you, and what do you want to achieve out of it? And so we have those conversations, and then we go from there. So then we build a fertility rack, a chemical rack, and a seeding rate to determine what that grower wants to get out of that.
So you're visioning, you're looking out into the future and backing up and saying, okay, here's what we have to do to get to the outcome or goal you want.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So what's a common goal of farmers these days as far as yield?
Yeah, so especially in this Grand Meadow area, if we're going to start with corn here, a lot of guys, especially these top end producers, they want 250 plus bushel corn. You know, there's a lot of guys that are still at the 210, 220, 230 mark. They're trying to push the envelope. And that's all dependent upon weather. I mean, if it stays dry for a long time, those yield goals may have to come down. But that's not the fault of the farmer. It's not the fault of the practices. It's just what Mother Nature hands you.
Well, since agronomy is the science of soil and crop production, I'm guessing you probably do some soil sampling.
Absolutely. So what we do in determining that fertility rack early on, in our planting stages is we do take soil samples. Usually we recommend every 4 years. Some guys are on 2-year rotations. So this field, for example, would have been sampled either last summer or last fall. We used that to build a fertility rec that had fertilizer put on this last fall, and then also the fertilizer is put on this year. And with all that data we start collecting over time, we start getting very good data points. And so then we start making, projections of where it's going to go moving forward into next year and the year after.
Well, this field is fairly uniform. There's a little bit of slope to it, but inside this field there's probably 3 or 4 soil types, wouldn't you say?
Correct, yep.
So does every recommendation in every part of the field be exactly the same?
Not in every case. So what we find actually is that we need to start doing, and we do already a lot of variable rate recommendations, what we call it. So based on soil type, based on yield data, we can also variable, say this field's got better soil type, higher production area. We can put more fertilizer where it's needed and less where it's not needed.
You test for pH?
Correct, yep.
So if there's an acidic soil, you need to add probably some supplements?
Yep, so then we get into liming and throwing lime out there, and that happens roughly every 4 years depending on the soil type, to make that soil back to its neutral state of where it needs to be.
Bring the pH up some.
Yep.
Well, this is a beautiful field, so I'm guessing besides seed selection, fertility, there's some other things you talk about too, perhaps tillage, seed placement, harvest, weed control, anything else?
Yeah, so there's a lot of conversations also had about cultural practices. So what can we do on the tillage side? What can we do with residue management? And how can we just be better stewards of the land while maintaining these better, more efficient yield goals? And that's a bigger conversation today than it was when I first started.
For sure. What happened on this field or fields like this for weed control?
So in this field specifically, there is an early application of a pre-emergence herbicide. So right as when the crop was sprayed, when the crop was emerging, and then there would also be a second one happening within the last 14 days.
And I noticed in the row there's a furrow or an opener. Has there been fertilizer put on since planting?
Yep, so another awesome application of being most efficient with our fertilizer is side dressing nitrogen is what we call it. So we found out that if you put all nitrogen on up front, it may not all be there if we get heavy rains like we did this spring. So how do we more efficiently place that when the crop needs it, which is now until tassel time? And so actually in this field that was also done, they side dressed nitrogen in there with Coulter style applicator that put it right next to the seed in the plant.
Probably liquid?
Yep.
It's so fun to see the corn, and probably a week ago maybe on this field, but all of a sudden it hits that fertility zone and it just greens up and goes. Have you noticed that too?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite times of the year.
And you talked a little bit about V8. Can you talk about stages of plant growth and what V8 means?
Yes, when I talk about V8 corn, pretty much they're talking about the leaf count, so, or the collar count of the corn, where the leaf meets the actual plant. So in this case, if the corn's V8, generally you get about 18 leaves before the corn tassels. Corn typically tassels here in another month, a little over. So between now and then, this corn will put on 10 more leaves and it will grow very fast. And it all starts off with emergence, and then after the first leaf, you just start counting, and then V18, it gets to the tassel point.
Wow, tasseling in a month. It's certainly the genetics, and that's what you're working with on that seed selection part, has improved our yields, but our short growing seasons need to have things happen pretty consistently and pretty fast, right?
Yeah, Minnesota is a very unique, especially southeastern Minnesota is a very unique environment in terms of growing corn and soybeans. We don't necessarily get all the growing degree units that they get to the west. It doesn't stay warmer as longer, and it doesn't warm up as quicker in the spring. So we have to definitely place a seed that's going to fit best in our area and think about that farmer's goals.
As I think about this crop, there's certainly a lot invested per acre, not even talking about the machinery, not even talking about the huge land investment or the interest on operating or the interest on the loan to finance the land. What kind of cost would you have from soil sampling, buying seed, putting in fertility, also weed control, and then harvest and processing that plant in terms of, or the seed in terms of drying it? What kind of cost would we be looking at?
Roughly this year, most growers are anywhere from that $1,000 to $1,100 an acre between all inputs, including rent, depreciation, machinery wear and tear, so to speak, and just the cost of labor.
And certainly a 500-acre farm is not considered large anymore, but take 1,000 or 1,100 times 500, we're well over $500,000 just in operating costs or input costs, not counting the fuel probably, not counting all the other things, right?
Right.
A little bit interesting and a little bit scary for a farmer. So they also buy crop insurance for risk protection. Why should somebody in our audience, as they're traveling down the road looking over at these crops, care if they're well cared for or not?
Well, I think agriculture really has and always has been the backbone of American society. And with that in mind, everyone needs to keep in mind where their food comes from, where their clothing comes from, where a lot of durable goods comes from. And it starts with agriculture. So if we aren't doing a good job of producing that crop, we're not doing a good job of producing for America and for the rest of the world for that matter. So it really comes down to knowing the acre, knowing what we can do best here that's going to impact everyone.
So when this crop is harvested, you talked about the world, where will this corn go?
A lot of this corn locally goes to ethanol production. There's multiple ethanol plants between Preston and Lisle and a couple others up by Claremont. And a lot of that goes actually to our fuel sources, which everyone is dependent on when they go to the pump.
So we're talking, and probably a third or slightly more of this crop will be used for fuel, but that still leaves a lot of about 2/3. Where does that go?
Yeah, so the majority of corn produced in the United States actually goes for additional cattle feed, for livestock feed, and then while the rest of it, the United States does produce a surplus, we actually export it to countries such as China. We do get into South America, Mexico, Canada, a lot of our good trading partners, and then they take advantage of it and are able to also use it for their society as well.
So when I buy chicken at the store, or I buy a pork chop or a beef steak, it might have started right here on this farm.
Absolutely.
Jamison, thank you so much. You do some great work, and thanks for sharing with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dan.
Stay tuned for more on Farm Connections.
Farm Connections Best Practices brought to you by Absolute Energy.
Hello, I'm Bruce Potter, Integrated Pest Management Specialist with the University of Minnesota Extension. And today on Best Practices, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a relatively new insect pest to Minnesota soybeans. Not that we didn't have enough pests before, but we picked up a new one. We confirmed it in Minnesota in 2018, although one of the growers had mentioned that he'd seen the problem for several years previous. In 2015 and through 2017, the insect was observed in eastern South Dakota, eastern Nebraska, western Iowa, but it was assumed to just be a secondary invader to soybean plants that were damaged by hail or disease. In 2018, this thing blew up in the spring, and we realized that this insect was capable of causing plant damage and death to soybeans all on its own. The adult larvae overwinter and pupate in the spring, and the adults emerge in mid-June. They lay eggs at the base of the soybean plant. If you're looking at the soybean field, a lot of times you'll see the damage worse on the edge of in fact, almost always you'll see damage worse on the edge of soybeans adjacent to the previous year's soybean crops, as that's where the adults move out of. To distinguish this from a disease, look at that lower stem, you'll see a dark discoloration. A lot of times there's kind of a black border between the green healthy tissue above and the damaged tissue below. But if you peel back that outer layer of the stem, the bark, if you will, you'll start to see some white to orange larvae in the stems. There's 3 larval instars, and they start out white. That last instar turns orange and is pretty distinctive. We've got a similar insect that feeds on white mold fungus. But this insect is not associated with white mold. It'll be on plants that are relatively disease-free. There's 3 flights of adults, the overwintering flight, one in July and another one in August. When the plant larvae are mature, they drop to the ground and pupate, and that last generation in August, the larvae are what overwinters. You'll start to see plants wilting in July, and again, damage is usually worse on the edge of the field. And as the season progresses, that damage affects more plants and moves further into the field. So if you see damage like that on your soybeans adjacent to last year's crop, pay some attention, take a look at what's underneath a few of the surface of some of those stems. We also have scouting video available, and there's a soybeangallmidge.org website that has quite a bit of information on this insect, fact sheets, webinars, when we're monitoring adult flights, so when those adults are out, will be posted on that as well. So thank you for listening. This has been Best Practices, and I'm Bruce Potter, the University of Minnesota Extension.
We're at Squash Blossom Farm, and with me is Susan Waffle. Susan, you're the proprietor, or one of?
Yes, I am. Thanks for coming.
You and Roger, what a delightful space. What inspired you to do this?
Oh, it's been a lifelong dream to be a farmer, and here we are in our old age doing it.
Not old age yet.
Well, yeah, retirement age at least.
You talked a little bit off camera beforehand about how you met this guy, Roger, and some of the things in your early days. Can you recant that?
Sure, we met in second grade, growing up in Bemidji, and we're friends all through high school and would go cross-country skiing in the winter. It's pretty cold up there, so afterwards we would go have hot chocolate and talk about our dream life would be like a farm, all devoted to growing your own food, music, art, the things that we loved. And who knew that we would actually end up married to each other and doing it?
You said something about utopia. Is this it?
Well, for me, it is. I've never been happier than on this place.
Awesome. What brings that happiness, and why do you share it?
I love being connected to the earth, hands in the dirt, breathing the fresh air, listening to the frogs and crickets, and just watching the seasons. And it just seems like not everybody gets that chance to be that close, and this is a really neat place, so we wanted to share it.
Well, everybody's definition of utopia is perhaps different, but certainly it seems like you've cultivated utopia here. How much work and how much time has it taken?
It's kind of funny. Well, we've been here 15 years and we kind of work 24/7 all the time, but it's the kind of work that is like play. Like when you were a kid and you played school, it was work, but it was really fun. It's like, when it's your dream, it doesn't really feel like work. But a lot of people walk up the driveway on a pizza night and say, whoa, this is my dream, but they don't really have a clue that how all-consuming it is to make that dream happen. You gotta love it.
It's a lot of work.
It is, yeah.
Now we know that Roger pulls from his architecture background to do some of the things here, but you're pulling from all the things that brought you to this space too, so tell us about that.
Well, I'm an artist, so that's a huge part. I kind of consider this farm to be an ongoing art project, my biggest art project ever. That's really fun. I have a lot of background working in nonprofits in renewable energy, waste reduction and recycling, and community building. So those are all aspects of what we do here. So that
seems like a perfect collision.
It is a perfect collision. A collision and a collusion.
Or I was admiring the fish, admiring the ceiling that you stenciled and painted. I mean, awesome.
Yeah, we're all about, recycling is part of our whole ethic on this farm, recycling and repurposing. So this mead room that we're in, was kind of our pandemic project, and we had a little more time to gather up all the materials. We've got a bowling alley floor and walk-in cooler panel ceilings that we stenciled and repurposed. Maybe it's this back bar came from the Restore. It might have been in a law office at one time. We turned it into our back bar. A bar, doors, church pews, everything is done on a small budget and a lot of love and labor.
That's beautiful, and it comes together well. Now you mentioned music, art, and food. Behind me is some art. Does that have a story?
Well, we found that art on Marketplace on Facebook, and it just seemed to be the right mood for our whole place, and I really love the style. And it turns out that it was once in the Loring Cafe, and we're trying to track down that artist who did it and tell her it's got a new home. It's been in storage for many years in somebody's garage, and now it's in a new little meadery, and it's got admiring customers to appreciate it.
Exactly. Storage, not so cool.
Yeah.
Meadery, yes.
Yes.
Enjoyment by many.
Right.
And so when you say Loring Park, as in Minneapolis?
Yes, the Loring Cafe was a really wonderful establishment in the 1980s that right on the park, Loring Cafe.
Well, your history goes back to second grade, and it's been a long journey, but you also had children on this farm that enjoyed and helped you do it, correct?
Right, our kids, I wish I could have raised our kids on a farm, but in retrospect, maybe it worked out better this way, because a lot of times kids who grow up on a farm can't wait to get off. Our kids never had that opportunity, but as soon as we bought this farm, they stopped out of college, came home and said, we're going to help you start the farm. So we are indebted to them. We envisioned it being kind of a little hobby farm, and we would continue our jobs and, dabble in chickens and gardening and bees. But they came home and they're inborn entrepreneurs, and they're going to raise money for college. So we started out our first year with cows, pigs, chickens, turkeys, geese, baking for the farmers market. We just dived into all of it, and I told them that they could do whatever they wanted as long as they didn't leave us with everything when they went back to college. And sure enough, our vegetarian daughters harvested all their meat animals and changed their whole lives.
What drives you to do this? It's a lot of work. I see the passion, but what drives it?
I don't know. Something weird about me. It's just the creative impulse and being connected to the community and the earth. And Raj and I are the best team for building things together. I couldn't ask for a better partner. I come up with the wacky ideas, and he makes them actually happen safely. So yeah, it's really just fun. And, our life is short. You got to learn as many things and squeeze as much into it as you can.
Well, you speak about change, and certainly this farm exhibits and displays and is rooted in pivoting, change, resilience, regeneration. Mm-hmm. Tell us more about that.
I was part of a group of local food entrepreneurs, and most of them did a product like salsa or coffee or a baked good or something, and they would say, what's your focus? And it would be like, well, it's not really a focus, it's an ecosystem. We have, everything supports each other. The animals take care of the garden and fertilize it, and we get the eggs for our baking, and our herbs and fruits and tomatoes for our baking and our pizza. And now having the mead offers a really wonderful product on a pizza night. You can imbibe a little bit of a yummy alcoholic beverage along with your pizza. It just seems to be an ecosystem. And the side benefit of that is that if something changes, like a pandemic, you can swivel a little bit. And during the pandemic, we did pretty well because we couldn't sell our goods at the farmers market anymore, but we did an online service through the farmers market and took orders. And since restaurants were closed, that was really popular. People could order frozen pizzas and soups and breads from us and still have a really nice dinner that they didn't have to prepare themselves. And it supported our farm, and it was a really interesting experience. And maybe a big restaurant or a fast food place would not be able to do that very easily, but because we have kind of situated ourselves as always changing and trying new things, it was really easy for us.
You definitely were resilient because you're still here.
Yeah, we're still here. We're still having fun.
No doubt you've brought a lot to the community that comes to you, but sometimes we learn from them too. What have you learned from the customers or the people that come here?
Oh, a lot of things. They're always, once they come here, they have a lot of ideas, things that we should try, people that we should know, resources that we should check into. And then, I should mention our neighbors. A lot of longtime farming neighbors, the neighbors across the road, have been here for 4 generations raising dairy cattle. And I'm sure that they thought we were kind of, silly coming here and trying to be farmers, but they were so kind and generous with their advice and their help. And they still, we get our wood for them for our wood-fired pizza. We hire them to till when we need it, or use their big equipment to clear out our, compost piles and stuff, because we do everything by hand. And, it's just a really nice micro community right here in our neighborhood. We have, other artists, and we share events, and it's really fun.
Isn't that what agriculture communities are like?
I didn't know that, but it is. It's great.
Susan, you're very accomplished, but I also heard that you wrote a book, and I happened to find it on your bar in the mead room at your farm. Tell us about this book.
Well, last year I applied to the Southeast Minnesota Arts Council for a grant to write this book. So it covered a tiny portion of my time. It was a really huge labor of love. But it's a book based on our adventures on the farm, the 15 years, and there have been so many things we did and so many things I wanted to include. I finally decided it had to be pretty short on words, so it's long on pictures because I take a lot of photos, and it also has a lot of my art in there. And it's in alphabetical order. It's alphabetical adventures in artisan agriculture. So I think that there's a little bit of technical information in there, and a few stories, and even a little poetry, but a lot of photos. And hopefully each photo will tell 1,000 words, so it has a lot more in there than you think.
It definitely does. It's delightful. It actually looks like your farm, and I recognize at least two of the farmers and some of the animals that live here. I must have your autograph, please.
I would be happy to sign my book for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing with us, Susan.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Stay tuned for more on Farm Connections. Well, that will about do it for today. We hope you enjoyed the program, and we hope to see you again next time. I'm Dan Hoffman. Thanks for joining us on Farm Connections.